This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the special operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is produced in partnership with Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm focused on helping you optimize the people side of your business. We're sponsored by Jersey Mike's Subs. Together, we share the mission of giving, making a difference in someone's life. Visit the Jedburgh podcast, Talent War Group, and Jersey Mike's Subs on the web and on social media. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Data is the ammunition of the future. Data determines what we know about ourselves, our adversaries, the environment, our friends, and well, basically anything. But collecting data is only the first step. What we do with that data, how we understand and interpret it, the decisions we make with it, are what make data the most powerful tool in the modern-day arsenal of both countries and companies. For this episode, I stepped out of the spring break Florida sun to sit down with Doug Philippone, Global Defense Lead for Palantir, one of the world's leading technology companies. Doug and I defined big data. We spoke about data as a decision-making tool, and why people both embrace and fear data's ability to provide both information and intelligence. As a former Army Ranger and West Point graduate, Doug started and has led Palantir's Global Defense division to scale as it competed with some of the world's largest and most institutionalized defense contractors. A David versus Goliath battle that has tested every facet and fiber of his leadership and resolve. Doug shares Palantir's rise, the hole in the market they've exploited, the challenges they faced breaking into the government procurement system, why a technology strategy is not IT transformation, and how AI and ML are changing the world order. Doug abides by the mantra of a lifetime of service to the nation, so he shares some of his new projects as he builds Snowpoint Ventures and continues to invest in public-private partnerships. Data is everywhere. We can fear it or we can embrace it, but we cannot escape it. Doug, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for welcoming us to your home in sunny Florida. It is like spring break here every day. Well, Dan, I have to credit Dan Rickert, who's hiding back here off camera. But Dan was served with me in 10th Special Forces Group, works with you now, has been instrumental in setting this conversation up with you. So I do want to give him credit. Thank you, Dan. And he did make that joke yesterday, though.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, welcome to the free state of Florida.
Well, we spend a lot of time on this podcast, especially the first half of this year, talking about grit and our ability to push through during adverse times. How do we buckle down, find a way to bring calm to chaos, solve complex challenges that really test our character and our values? We first explored grit in terms of personal achievement and professional goals, but I've recently expanded this conversation to include a critical discussion on world order. And I think it's important because we are currently challenged by what I've called our frenemies, or these near peer powers in the world like Russia, China, and also clear adversaries, Iran, North Korea. Newt Gingrich, who I interviewed a few weeks ago, said anyone who seeks to have nuclear weapons could possibly be considered one of our adversaries. But the conflict in Ukraine has put front and center our premise that leaders and leadership matters now in the world and in the world order more than possibly it ever has, as we may possibly be closer to the brink than we've ever been. So we've also spent some time, especially recently, working on this concept of VUCA, or a complex world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and how do we as leaders effectively manage our emotions, our responses, find solutions to the problems that have no linear resolution, problems that require not only action, but the understanding that when we take an action, there's probably going to be a second and third order effect that we may or may not be able to understand and be forward looking to understand how we're then going to respond to those. Today we live in a world that is more connected than ever. You know this more than anybody else. At the center of this connectivity sits this word data. Data, facts and statistics collected together for reference or analysis, one definition. Another one, things known or assumed as facts, making the basis of reasoning or calculation. But data, information, intelligence, whatever you want to call it, whether it's raw or aggregated, allows leaders to make educated and informed decisions to respond to chaos, confusion in the VUCA world. Palantir sits at the center of big data. Palantir has led data aggregation in the industry in both public and private sectors for the better part of the last decade. I sit here today in my circa 2013 Palantir t-shirt, right? And I have to ask you though, before we get into this, I'm going to make you solve, or maybe I'll do it after. You have to solve this riddle. Okay? We'll put some pictures up on it too. But you're going to need to solve this riddle at the end. We're going to circle back. Don't let me forget. But that's what it's about. That's what Palantir has done. It has taken data and it has created these frameworks and these platforms to be able to analyze it, triage it, and then allow leaders to make more informed decisions. Maybe not perfect decisions, but more informed decisions, and that's what we seek to do. When I thought about the next conversation of the VUCA world, there was no better person to talk to than you. Former Army Ranger, you have built Palantir's Global Defense division. Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you. It's really great to have this opportunity, and obviously I'm humbled. It feels a little bit surreal, but as I've gotten through my life journey here. But yes.
Well, we're going to talk about it all. And there's hundreds of directions that we could go. When we were talking on the phone yesterday, we laid out a whole bunch. I've done my best, I think, in my terms, to lay out how I view the importance of data in the world today. But you've been with Palantir now for the better part of 14 years, almost the entire lifespan of the company. You've been involved in every aspect of the development of the software. You've pushed when others said to hold, don't push. You've done that internally within the company. You've done that externally. Can you describe for me, in your words, this concept of big data? What is it? What does it mean? Why is it so important in the world today?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I think about my journey just in life, and then how that kind of intersected with my time at Palantir, there was a funny moment in the early days of when I joined Palantir. I literally had to look up data
like I did last night.
and I was like, it was, when I first joined, it was funny because I have a mathematics degree, so I'm like, in certain circles I'm thought of as a technical human being, but I was like, when they say data, what the hell does that mean?
Right.
And then when I just sort of transferred that into layman's terms, it's just like, it's about, whether how raw it is or not, it's about information in some capacity. Or how do you turn, you can get technical in the definition here, but why does data matter is when it's turned into information that you can make decisions on, right? And so and I think, in the world that you're describing that we live in today, it's versus even as big as it was when I started, it was around this idea that like there's information being collected everywhere, whether it's through sensors or computers or just any systems. There's always something being stored, and then how do you turn that into something useful? And that's the core. If you think about what anybody really cares about, or most of the tech businesses, it's like, how do you turn data into something useful?
Why do people fear it now? I asked that question because when we think about organizations and companies like Meta, and people are now looking and they're saying, oh, well, Meta owns all of your data. They own everything about you. We need to fear it. I don't get that perspective when I talk to you or I think about Palantir. I think about you're using data I'd say for good in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, first of all, you should understand we had a completely different approach to all of this stuff. When you think of some other companies, they literally, your data and personal information is their business, and that's obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but that was a fundamental difference from when Palantir was formed, and it was really around the ideas. If you think about after 9/11, a few people don't remember this, but if you've been around for a while, you do. But the Patriot Act and And there was this idea that you had to make a binary decision. Security and civil liberties was this trade-off.
Yeah.
And so our thought was around this idea that you can use technology so you don't have to make that choice. And how can you protect civil liberties while ensuring safety? Mm-hmm. And the idea of technology, at least at Palantir, was, one, the government's going to screw this up. Right. And so we need to bring, our entrepreneurial spirit to solving this problem so that there's not a trade-off. So we just believe that that's a false choice, is you can protect civil liberties and all of your information so that only people, if you think about, normal warrants and so forth, it's like only the people who are allowed to see this and have a reason to see this can. That was really important. And it was just fundamental of like, look, we don't own in many ways, like we make the architecture that moves the data around and protects it so that you can make informed decisions. It's just fundamentally different.
So going back to if we think about for a second the founding of Palantir, Peter Thiel, Alex Karp, 2004, originally the algorithm was based on an anti-fraud algorithm from PayPal. But then after 9/11, as you referenced, there's an opportunity here to potentially use this to in counterterrorism operations. There's a quote here I want to read, and it's in 2004. When we looked at the available technology, we saw products that were too rigid to handle novel problems and custom systems that took too long to deploy and required too many services to maintain and improve, unquote. To many extents, this is a battle that you're still fighting today, and I want to get into that in a few minutes. But one of the core foundational elements of Palantir is they say, we believe in augmenting human intelligence, not replacing it. Entrepreneurism and the entrepreneurial spirit and drive are important parts of our conversations on the podcast. Palantir launched and took on entrenched defense industry behemoths, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing. You, since that point in time, have been at what I call in the middle of the 1 meter knife fight. Can you talk about the hole in the market that you saw when you looked at the big defense contractors, the way that they were looking at the data problem, the customization of the products that they were creating, and then how Palantir could come into the market and pioneer a new way to think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could definitely talk about that for a minute. I think, but just in full disclosure, like in 2004, 2005, I was on the Syrian border.
You were still in the army at that point.
I was in JSOC at that point. But yeah, but that was the start of my transition over there. But I think like the issue there was. And I think it's even more foundational now. Like this is more of a problem now than it even was then, and it was a big problem then. Is that you fundamentally didn't have the ability to move data around between systems and have any ability to like understand the pedigree of the information or the security of that information before it would move around. And so you had these problems where. You have one system that kind of works. You have a bunch of systems that either work or don't work. Mm-hmm. And but there was never a holistic enterprise that could move the information either throughout an agency with safeguards or certainly not between agencies. And then you had, and again, this is even a worse problem now, and it's probably why, it's one of many reasons why Palantir has been so successful in both the commercial markets and broader government around the world is that these large IT projects, there's a difference between like when you build things that, most people don't understand this and they shouldn't, but the difference between making an app, like an application, mm-hmm. Like on the iPhone App Store or something like right. that, or in the sense of I'm making what's called enterprise software. Mm-hmm. The difference in complexity is massive. And so it's something like you could go to school, you have a college degree of some sort. You don't really even need a college degree. You just have to be a generally smart human being. And I could train you for a month and you could build some apps. And then there's, it's a relatively low bar to like build some apps.
There's like no code apps that you could build out.
Exactly, right. It's just like you're just clicking, they're like macros, right? And it's just like, yeah, I could just get in there.
It's like 10 minutes.
Yeah, and you're like, and there's enough infrastructure around in the world where you can just do that stuff. But then the difference between, what does it mean to have enterprise software? That's one of the hardest things out there. It's like, by most metrics, you can read this like, 93+% failure rate on those types of projects. And but when people have figured out how to do this, they're the biggest companies in the world.
Right.
But most, who tries to make the most enterprise software? The largest companies in the world and government. And most of those things or those systems are mostly failures. But the problem ends up being with, just the way there's lack of accountability in a lot of ways, but there's, mostly it's just change the name and keep on going on. But tackling that thing, and I want to make sure I'm not getting too off topic here, but tackling that problem of, in the early days, can we get a bunch of what many would think of as the smart, at least you're trying to recruit the smartest engineers in the world, but can you actually get a working system that actually works first to solve this problem and then go to market with that? Mm-hmm. That's why it took, the quote that you made versus when I started was a 4-year difference. So it was just like, you're not selling to anybody, you're just building something that actually works before you even go to market, right, versus a PowerPoint promise that then you're going to say you're going to build it. But then the risk of failure is pretty massive.
Well, I remember my first experience with Palantir was in Africa in 2013. And they'd been around for a while. I think I remember like loosely hearing about it. But we're in East Africa, and we know that we don't know a lot about the continent. Like you have your normal intelligence collection efforts through, the embassies and the different organizations that are out there, and you have military units and special forces teams throughout the region, but there was nothing where we could look at and be like, okay, I have a sense of what's happening on this complex continent where everything's trying to kill you, including like the land itself. Sure. At times. Yeah, sure. was our joke. And so we put this challenge kind of back up to our headquarters of what can we do, right? And lo and behold, a couple weeks later, these two guys show up with Palantir T-shirts, right? a box of Palantir T-shirts and a couple of Panasonic Tough Books, yeah, right? And they're like, we need 10 TVs and a conference room. We're like, what do you need? Like, first of all, I don't have 10 TVs. And second, like, we're living in a container here. I don't have a conference room. Like, you can have maybe that little closet over there and 3 TVs. Right, what are you doing? And then they end up creating what they call this monitoring center, right? And we were like, I don't know what that does. So, eventually maybe I'll come talk to you, but I got other things to do. And then there was a coup it was like March of 2013. There was a coup in Central African Republic. And we had teams who were in and about the area. We had teams working the Lord's Resistance Army effort. And all of a sudden, it's like, wait, I think those guys in there might know what's going on because they're aggregating fees and all sorts of other stuff. And then now here we are, the entire staff sitting in this room with these two guys who are now giving us a lot more understanding of what was going on in the environment. And so I felt like for me that was a huge eye-opening experience as to what some level of data aggregation can do. Now, I will say that and you can certainly talk about it, but the company has advanced tremendously leaps and bounds beyond that. But from an early experience, that's my Palantir story.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can think. I mean, first of all, that's great to hear that it helped you in the real world, because obviously that's what we're trying to do. But I do think that to your point about it's progressed a lot. Some people don't understand the idea that software is never done. Every day we have, 2,500 or so engineers, and they're waking up and they're building the new Palantir every day. And that's informed by all sorts of things that we've seen over the years in a variety of problems about either the industries or the problems that you see, the different data that you're seeing around the world. But this is what sort of appealed to me most, when I left the military and joined Palantir, was this idea of like lifetime of service, of like how can you how can you continue to serve in some way in a different capacity after your body breaks or whatever, right? And so I can't jump out of airplanes anymore, but I could lean on my math degree and go do something useful for the world. And so the idea for me as a commander was thinking about, you're just trying to figure out what's going on and make good decisions. And from a technical perspective, the challenge ends up being that the way the majority of the world works is people aggregate information and then they put it in flat formats. And what flat formats would be like, I'm putting that in a Microsoft Word or PowerPoint thing, and it's a static thing that it's not a living, breathing thing. And then I'm presenting it to you and it has a timestamp on it.
Right.
You know, this information is as of a time date group, right? And then they're like, this is what we think.
That's like what they teach you to put on there. Like,
right. Just so you know
how long is it of value?
Right. And so, but the interesting from a technical perspective, it was this idea of like, how do you change this paradigm? Because when you think about how do you, there's this, it's a little bit of a joke because I think most people are generally institutions are a failure at this, where it's like the idea of knowledge management. Like, what does that mean, right? And typically, from my experience working with government or the military, it was this idea of like, I had these file folders of, op orders that were written on PowerPoint slides, or there's maps or emails or something that you had collected, and then you put it in a hard drive. And then as you leave, you hand it off to somebody else, and then they may or may not read it or whatever. But it's
most likely not.
Yeah, and then it's hard to find, and so you just don't have this living, breathing thing. And so what we found is like a lot of the lack of progress was this idea that you're not learning from the past, and you're not improving every day. You're not improving based off the knowledge of other people, right? You're just forgetting, and then you're having to learn it again. Right. And so how do you, obviously Afghanistan is over, but the idea is, during that 20 plus year period or whatever it was, we probably fought 40 wars, every 6 months.
Oh, every 6 months.
Yeah. You're like, you just fight it over. And it's like, man, if I only would have known. And so I was like,
that was the worst. Like we would switch with Fifth Group in Iraq, and we would come in. We would immediately think everything they did was wrong. We would do it our way. They would come in, spend 2 weeks telling us how everything we did was wrong.
Right.
Do it their way. We come back 6 months later, have the same conversation, and it was exactly what happened. You just continue to fight the same war.
And so then the problem is, like understanding what people need. If you think about like even being a politician, like in many of these areas, you know this better than I do as a former special forces operator, is the idea of like the local populace or the villages, right? And they the local elder, where do they live? What do they care about? What's the school? What's the water supply? Or there's like a pump, or like what did I give them money for so that they could, they could farm or something. And then the new unit comes, you don't have a record of like, hey, there's a dam project and the elder really cares about that, and this is where and so you lose all this stuff. And then there's huge fraud and waste. We had the special IG for Afghanistan reconstruction and Iraqi reconstruction, where we're just seeing how the billions of dollars that we just wasted, or ended up on a plane that went to Dubai. Like all this stuff that's avoidable. I'm giving you like a broader background of the problem, and I haven't really hit the solution. But the idea here is, from my perspective as a commander, one of the things, my final tours, were on the Syrian border and then in Ramadi when it was pretty ugly still. And it was like you started to see, when I saw very early Palantir, which is funny in retrospect, how much it's changed. Right. It's like not even the same thing. But the idea of like, how could I have stored this information in a way that was really meaningful, so I could search and discover it and find it with pedigree? Because one of the things that's the problem with these PowerPoint slides, at least in like the military and intelligence context, is that it loses the pedigree of where did this information come from? Like, why do you know it? And that's always been, and then this is a very critical thing for civil liberties as well, is that if you don't, from a technical perspective, if you don't have what's called the pipeline of like, where is the raw source of this information coming from? Where it could be an interview that you did, that's handwritten that becomes typed into a thing. It could be a video. It could be, some ISR camera. It could be electronic intercepts. It could be information from the internet. It could be a plethora of data sources. There's literally thousands of these things. We'll call it a data source.
Right.
That could really mean any of those things I just said. But understanding where do those things live? And so this becomes like, there's this term I took from a book I read. It was just pretty funny. It's sort of a fake word, but it's called a complected system. And the idea of like, when you have these independent, call them apps, when I went back to my earlier comment of how easy these things are to make, and this is where the government sort of struggles, is sometimes you have these independent capabilities that both work and they're both useful, but then they interact with data or information separately, independently. So you have all of these data sources, and then you have all of these tools, and the tools are the apps, right? That do something useful for you. And then those independently sit on all the data sources, and then you have to, so basically what you end up doing is building a platform one-off forever. And you're like, okay, well, this tool number A interacts with data source A, B, C, D, and then you start to think about the complexity of that, and then how do you protect the lineage of that and who's allowed to see it. So you have access control, right? And then you have to do the next tool. And then, okay, well, how are these two tools interact with each other? And then how, as the operator, do you log into a website and then you have to go to each little thing? And that's sort of how the government was doing it. And that was the landscape of how we were like, wow. The world didn't know it at the time, but Palantir was really onto one of the most valuable problems in the world if you solve it. It's how do you build a platform that lays on top of all the data sources and, n+1, right? It could literally go to infinity. And it could be the old IBM mainframe from the 50s, or it could be the most cutting edge, AI sensor now, right? And anything in between. And it could be different data file formats and so forth. And then normalize the data. It's called an ontology, but it's like the schema of like, how do you, when you model the world in the data formats from before, it could be from 50 years ago. So you call it a car, but there's no sense of like a car stereo.
Right.
Right. And then now it's like you have all these different terms, or has backup cameras. Well, you didn't have that. And so that, that's just sort of a funny example of how the world changes. So the world changes all the time, right? And you don't call things the same as you used to call them. But then if you have some like rigidly locked schema from 50 years ago, that becomes a technical challenge of like, how do you normalize? You're calling these things subtly the same thing or one off. These become, over time, it becomes what's called complected, is that if you want, think of a rope, and all of the twine of the rope interlocking. It's like when you have one, it becomes simple. But now when you make one change, it affects every other twine in that rope. And so that is the difference between apps and enterprise software, where you have like all these interdependencies of like, oh, I want to do some really quick tweak to this stuff. And then you have to start thinking about, well, when you make that change to what's called the front end, what you look at, how does that affect everything in the entire enterprise?
Right.
And it gets complicated. And then that's where these big systems fail. So anyway, the long story short is that was the hardest technical challenge of like, you want to make this information useful for you to make a decision. It takes a while to get there.
Let's talk about you for a few minutes.
Oh, man.
Now he's really on the spot. West Point graduate in math, you referenced it, 2-year class president, master's in terrorism operations and finance from the Naval Postgraduate School. You studied machine learning at MIT. 6 deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan between 2003 2007. He served in Ranger Regiment majority of that time. 3 Bronze Stars, 2 with Valor, Joint Commendation Medal with Valor. Generally known as an innovator and a disruptor who brings critical thinking to complex challenges. Why go into the Army in the first place?
Oh, that's interesting. So I enlisted in the Army, actually. So I went to I went to sort of a fancy high school in Arizona, and it was sort of assumed like you're on the treadmill of like everyone's going to college is what you're doing.
Yeah, no choice.
And so I got on the conveyor belt to the lemming farm, and it did about a year, and I was basically a complete failure at college the first time, and I had always really wanted to. I would always been into the military, and I thought about serving, and even though my family goes way back. No one was a professional soldier, but going back to my great grandfather served in World War I, my grandfather was in World War II, and my dad was served during Vietnam. He didn't go to Vietnam, but basically everybody had served, and so it was my parents were hippies, so it was a little bit of like how you rebel against your parents, and it's like my parents were hippies, so I was like a young Republican. It was like you do the opposite or whatever, and I was like I'm going to join the military. And my mom cried. But I really wanted to do something super challenging. And, so I got the idea and, I had a Ranger contract. So I enlisted and went down to 1st Ranger Battalion after I passed all the tests and stuff. And, anyway, I think it was just about doing something really hard. And then when I was in Ranger school, it was filled with West Point, younger West Point. I was a private first class at the time, but you don't wear rank, so you don't know. And anyway, they had told me, all these friends that I had made in Ranger school, they were like, hey, you should try to go to West Point. And so when I graduated Ranger school, I went back to Hunter Army Airfield was the little base in Savannah. And I went to the education center and took the SATs and applied. And, I was going to just continue on my Army career, and I think at the very last second in May or something, some smart kid probably ended up going to Harvard or something, and they had one spot and they gave it to the Ranger kid. And so anyway, so I got to go to West Point. I think I found out in early May or something, so I was probably like, we'll give him a chance.
Right, yeah, then you were right into it.
Yeah.
So after West Point, then you went back and continued to serve in JSOC.
Yeah. So then I was an officer and, back in the infantry or whatever. And then I loved the Rangers, and I just wanted to go back to the Rangers.
It's a great organization.
Yeah. So then when I was, I had done my, time or whatever, I applied back to the Rangers and got in. And then I basically spent my time, every time I was eligible as an officer, I went back. And then, until I got hurt and was medically retired, my last job was the S3 at the Special Troops Battalion in the Rangers.
Talk to me for a second about some of the leadership that comes out of that. And so you've gone now, transitioned out, and you got out in 2008, and you've now gone into building this department and building this massive division within Palantir. When you think about what you take from your time in the Ranger Regiment, what are some of the core principles that apply?
Well, it's interesting because, I think, Dan can attest to this. He's sitting here, but I think, and anybody who has been friends with me during this time, they've always known me as like, I'm a maverick of sorts, or a rebel is the more pejorative term. Troublemaker.
It's fine. It's because your parents were hippies.
Yeah, I was always rebelling against something. And then it's funny. It's like Palantir's thought of the most rebellious company, and then I was a rebel within Palantir, which is funny. But
it's what gets things done.
Yeah, no, I think,
shake it up.
Look, I had a very different military career, just to be clear. And, even at West Point, it's like funny, even though I was a class president, I was always getting in trouble. But in the Rangers, I think like I had a different career, for a variety. I was, whether I was at the right place at the right time through my entire life, which sort of seems like it. But it was also about taking advantage of opportunities and like learning how to if I think about the most important things that I learned through my military experiences, it's mostly formed by the war more than anything, and just figuring things, because you're almost, you're seldom trained for the thing that you were having to do. Right. It's not like we weren't training. We're training all the time. But it was like you were thrown into these things where you just had to figure it out. And because of, for a lot of reasons, one, JSOC was spread super thin, so you were oftentimes elevated way above your pay grade and doing super complicated things with no adult supervision. And then all of a sudden I was the adult and I'm like, oh man, I better figure this out. And, and it's an enormous responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and many times it was like, look, I was out on the edge of the moon by myself. And, my closest guy, this is where I, became friends with Stan McChrystal, but it was like, I literally, as a commander, you're out there, you have to figure it out. And you have some sort of a high level intent from a 3-star general who's, 4 hours away, right. Or you're talking to him on a satellite conference call or something like that. And you just have to you have to understand what's the highest level intent. And then I on the ground have to figure this out with my folks. This is a bit of a longer story, but the important part of that is that I felt like my experience in war, in very nebulous environments where your life depends on it, and you have to win, it defined my whole life, right? And so coming into a startup community, that part actually felt very natural to me. And
because there's chaos all around,
and you have to figure it out.
Yeah,
and in many ways, we were joking around. Dan and I talk about this a lot, but it's like when I started at Palantir, it's probably like the first 3 days. We had this like getting started guide thing, and it was like, following this list of like installing servers, you doing all this stuff, and I was like, I'm gonna get fired
on day 3.
Yeah, and I'm like literally like Googling data, and it was just sort of like I need to figure out my own path here, because if I let them just tell me what to do, they're gonna probably tell me something stupid. Mm-hmm. And they're not gonna know how to take advantage of my skills, and I just need to figure this out. Because I'm rebuilding my life here, and like I know that I can add value, and I know that I could be the best person, but it's not what they're going to tell me to do.
Right.
And so about that time, it was like I remember telling Sham, our COO, I was like, hey, you know what? I'm going to stop doing this, and I'm just going to do something else. And the great thing about from Palantir as being like the perfect place for I think for true entrepreneurs, but specifically for me was, I stopped following the plan on day 3 and never looked back. And it was like this idea where if you have this, like, going back to the military and what formational experiences, it's like, if you do something useful or you're producing outcomes, people will leave you alone.
Yeah,
and they'll resource you, right? So it's like the idea
Mm-hmm.
of like, they'll pile resources into you where you can hire people, you could do things, they'll support you. And you just need to just keep kicking ass.
The question goes from what are you doing to what do you need?
Exactly. Yeah. And, but I will tell you, there was definitely a certain times during my career where it was internally, there was a lot of friction of like, what the hell is Doug doing? I think they still say that today, but I've always had like amazing support, from leadership of just like, we're investing. And what I felt was, I always had carte blanche, but it was like, as long as I don't screw up that trust mm-hmm. and I deliver, they'll support. And that part of it has been amazing. But I do believe that like figuring out how to win in war, I mean, from a startup perspective, it's, the closest that a civilian will come to war is like living in the startup world where you have to figure it out. You have a limited amount of money. You have to build a product, you have to sell a product, and then families' lives depend on it, right? Like you have to feed families, right? That's important.
You brought up General McChrystal, and I want to ask you a question about him because I believe that one of the biggest things you take away from leadership in the military is the classification of risk and risk versus opportunity and the analysis that you have to make as a decision maker. Data, information, intelligence, you've mentioned them all, but they're tools that leaders use to better understand the environment, to better classify risk levels, and then make a decision based on that. And I think that applies not only in the military, but it applies to the startup world. It applies to even Fortune 500 companies who've been around for 150 years. It's all about the risk categorization and then the inputs that they're using to make those decisions on. We had General McChrystal on in episode 34 when we talked about his risk immune system, how leaders and organizations detect, assess, respond, and learn from risk. I told you I wasn't going to quiz you on those. I'll hold to that, and we won't tell Stan about it either. Yeah. but I'm interested in your thoughts on how do you create an environment and keep that environment going over time as you have within this organization, where you encourage subordinate leaders to take risks and act decisively, even when they don't have all the information that they need to make the best decisions, but they have to make the right decisions based on the time and the place where they're at. And I asked you this question because you have brought up in several conversations that you've had external to this one, the fact that leaders have to act. People have to take action. You can't sit back and wait for everything to be perfect. If you do that, then you're missing opportunities. So when you think about creating an environment in an organization where people are encouraged to take action, how do you maintain that over time?
Well, there's a lot there.
I tend to do that. I told you I was going to do that at one point today.
I'm like, oh man.
I'll give you the 4-hour question and the answer is 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm like, oh man, I don't even know what you just said. No, look, I'm pretty aggressive. And there is a certain amount of, like how much look, there's a technical answer. I think that there's there's a Palantir answer for this, and then like a Doug Philippone / like how does Doug and Palantir, how are they the same thing and how are these morphed together? But part of this is like, I think from the technical Palantir side is like that process. I don't know the framework that Stan was talking about, which is fine. But the idea of just understanding what's going on, right? Do you even know what's going on at all, right? And so like, what decision are you making? And how does it relate to the real world? Do you even have accurate information? And how do you assess the source of that information so you can really understand? Because otherwise you're making really poor decisions. It's not because you aren't trying, but you just don't have all the information. And that's a challenge of modern warfare, is you're trying to make the best decision as quick as you can. Because sometimes you can wait 3 weeks and make a better decision, but you don't have that time.
Right.
And so you're like, based on the information that I have right now, what's the best decision that I can make? And how do you even calculate the risk? Like, what's the downside of this? And so many of the things that I work in, this is like a little bit of a combination of my math background and Palantir versus the real world. It's like, there's a thing called constrained optimization, where you're trying to optimize one thing based off of a lot of different variables that all have different trade-offs. And how can you figure out, they call it the Pareto optimal solution. It's like, how do you get the best solution given all of these constraints? How do you figure that out really quickly? And sometimes you don't understand the cost of your decisions. Like you can make, like sometimes you'll have this false dilemma of like you're presented these decisions and then you don't really, it's impossible to understand the risk because you don't know the second and third order effect of those decisions, right? And so that's one of the things, from what we try to do with Palantir, we're working on, or we actually have solutions for this, but it's like, how do you know when you make this decision, what's the fourth order effect that it's going to be for the person in East Africa? Right. What's that decision? Resource allocation, and you don't even know what this means, right? Okay, so that's one side of it. I think we're working hard from a technical solution of like, how do you let commanders understand as many of the inputs you have and the cost of those decisions, because then you can really calculate the risk of that, and put that to the forefront as much as possible. The second part, from like a more personal perspective, is this idea of like, err on the side of just doing something and be bold. right? And you can always, I make fun of lawyers all the time, but like their default mode is do nothing.
Do not, just wait to see what happens. Maybe it'll go away.
Yeah, no, totally, right? Yeah, go back to sleep.
Yeah, it's like if you want to know, bring in the lawyer and the HR guy. and I work in HR, so I can say that.
Oh, okay, good.
Now the lawyers will send me hate mail.
Yeah, you said all that, not me. Yeah. No, but I mean, I always joke, when I'm sometimes I'm having this conversation with Sean, but it's like, I joke, it's like, look, if you want me to go back to sleep, that's easy.
Right.
But I'm talking about doing something, and doing something always has risk, right? But I think if I think of all of the ways, especially when you're trying to be an entrepreneur and you're trying to change the status quo that's broken, you have to be bold, and you have to break a little glass. There's like, I don't know. You don't have to be a jerk about it, but you have to. You're by definition changing the status quo, and you're messing with other people's rice bowls, and
they get protective.
Yeah, and they get really protective. And what I had to find out really the hard way. I think when I think about the beginning of Palantir, we were all naive and we're like, oh, we're going to make this great product that actually works. Which is it's funny, but that's not a given, right? And it actually works. People like it, and it's cheaper. We're like, this is going to be so easy. This is going to be so easy. And then the next thing you know, it was like, the frozen middle, the bureaucrats, whatever you want to call them, were like moving heaven and earth. Like the one time, I'll say, I don't know if I read this or whatever, but the one time that a bureaucracy is agile is while defending itself.
Right. Yeah.
And they were like, we are going to stop Palantir, and it was like, we were just upsetting the whole status quo. And it was like, I was like, wow, this is actually harder than fighting Al-Qaeda. But I mean, in many ways, the idea of like, we wouldn't have won our battle if I hadn't been at war and been able to like stare in the dragon's mouth. I mean, there's definitely times when I wanted to quit, like I literally flipped in New York one time and I was riding in a vehicle with Dr. Karp and I was like, hey sir, do you still want me to do this? Right. Because this is like, super, super hard. And I'm not totally convinced that any amount of hard work or talent will equal victory. Mm-hmm. And then there was this moment where he had this, I think, the defining moment of leadership for me. He gave me what I needed, but it was just sort of like, look, he said, look, Doug, if any soldiers need this or want this, you should keep fighting. It's too important. And I was like, okay, I could work with that. And then, so I literally got out of the SUV and I was like, all right, I'm back in the fight. I know how to do this. And anyway, and then just 1 week later, we had some, minor victory on the frontier. And I was like, all right, the campaign is still going. And I have just enough tactical success to be like, all right, I'm I can win this thing. And, just because at times it can be like overwhelming of like, I don't know if I can beat Goliath, right. But anyway, I probably got off topic there, but it's important. Just do something. You have to do something.
Well, let's talk about that battleground, right? And that battleground comes down to what you've called really this battle between technology strategy versus IT transformation. And how does Palantir look at it, right? And how you look at it as it on the side of technology strategy versus the government procurement system or institutional legacy defense contractors or technology builders who say that it's an IT transformation. Can you define those two and just talk about that divide?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there's like, depending, getting on to what exactly I'm defining, but There is like a paradigm of like whether it's large corporations. Large corporations end up looking a lot like the government, even though they all pretend like they aren't anything like the government. Yeah. The larger the corporation, it looks a lot like the government. And even within Palantir, we have a commercial wing and a government wing, and early on it was like the commercial folks were all like, "Ha ha, it's going to be so much easier. We're going to be so nimble." And it was like, "Oh man, they needless to say, they've called me a few times and asked for my advice." But basically, you see the same paradigm of like, whether it's the commercial side or the government side, is this thing of like, we're going to pontificate and we're going to write a strategy paper of how we're going to transform, and we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to do like a data cataloging thing, or we're going to have some big grand transformation thing, and you're like, well, what are you really doing? And this is why I talk about, this goes back into the thing of just like, you actually have to just go do something and start somewhere and build. I mean, this is the idea of like, you solve a problem and you keep going. And like, there's this idea where you have this like paralysis by study, and the government is obviously the worst at this, but it's like, let me do a 3-year study, or like, when you look at some of the large, like JADC2, the Joint All Domain Command and Control or whatever. It's like this large, it's not even a thing. It's like a policy, or that's not even the right word, but it's a framework to build an implementation around. So basically the joint community, the different services can talk to each other and exchange information and command and control forces and, and win wars, right? And so, but the idea of that is like, okay, well, let's study this and understand the system. They're just like writing about it. It's like Congress is basically begging them to do it, and they still are like, there's no actual. Anyway, I can go off topic there for a while, but that is an example of or these large projects that are like nothing happens,
right?
And then like in the government frame, it's like there's a problem with the way that the requirements and acquisition process. So basically, a service would say, "I have a requirement, to do something." And then you're like, all right, well, then we're going to have like a requirements generator of like people. Okay, we're going to list down all the requirements you have, and then they're going to have an acquisition community to say, okay, I'm going to validate these requirements, and then you're going to build an acquisition approach, and then you're going to solicit whatever you're going to solicit from vendors to like, can we do this? And then you field it, and then it's like 5 years later, and then it doesn't work as advertised in the first, but this is 5 years ago. As opposed to how can you like rapidly iterate, like give them something and then modify that something, and how do you get into that dynamic of like get going with something? And this is a fundamental problem with acquisition. I don't know what we're going to solve in our lifetime, but we've seen some changes in the system, like around the idea of prototypes. They have these things called Other Transaction Authority, which is like this old government thing where it's from the 60s, I think, from NASA. And it was just basically like it was a legal framework where acquisition people could field prototypes quicker. It's been pretty successful. But from our perspective at Palantir, but I think this is the whole venture community. This is where like the government needs to lean in on this, because otherwise you're not going to get entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs can't break in. Right. And the idea is, if you have a better mousetrap, you just show up with a prototype. And if it works, then you compete with other things that work. I mean, that's like the most important thing when you think about Palantir's battle to break in. It was this idea that initially, when I go back to 2008, we weren't competing with real things. We were competing with PowerPoint. And in many ways, we're still around the world. We're competing with a CIO or a CTO, somebody who's talking about a thing that they don't have, and they're going to build it. And it's going to be better, and the organization will own it, or the government will own it, and it's going to be cheaper. And it never shows up, and it always costs 10 times more. But this idea that like from the entrepreneur spirit, where people can show up with a real thing, where they've actually taken investors' capital and they built something cool that can help solve a problem. You show up and it's a prototype and it works. And much like when Palantir got to start in the military, it was about, we're just going to show. We didn't know what we didn't know, but we were just like, let's just show this to somebody and they'll give you feedback on if it's useful. And they'd be like, do you want to buy this? And they're like, usually yes. And then we'd have to figure out for like the next 6 months, figure out how to buy it. We didn't know.
Right. Yeah. Solve that problem when you get there. I mean, this acquisition process is something that you've brought up, I think, in a couple of different contexts. We've had a conversation about it too. I think it was in episode 35. We talked to retired General Craig Weldon, and he works for a company now. He's the president of a company called Palantir Hypersonics. And I think you've referenced hypersonics too in a variety of conversations, because this battlefield of hypersonics is coming to the forefront, right? This is a technology that hasn't been iterated on since the 1960s with the SR-71 Blackbird, which was then like retired in 1999. Yet, here we are saying that we have a hypersonic technology that's decades and decades old, and China is advancing this technology at a rapid pace. And then I think you talked about, well, how do you get ahead of a hypersonic weapon? You don't allow it to launch.
Yeah.
Right. But if you look at the government procurement process, where they're building these customizable tools, and I think about Blue Force Tracker that we had in all of our vehicles, and primarily we unplugged it because it drained the battery and it sat there dead and it never worked. And yet every time you needed it to operate, you had to call a contractor who had to come, and you're looking at this person making $1,000 a day sitting in Iraq fixing this piece of equipment that like I used to carry a Garmin GPS that worked better than the Blue Force Tracker in telling me where I actually was. But you've got a solution that is sitting here at 80%, right? And it's scalable. When you talk about agility, do you think that the government and the procurement process can get to a point where they can see that light, right? Because you referenced that, can you give a product that everybody looks at? But on the other side of that, they have to be willing to actually accept it, and they have to be able to break down these institutional walls of the Goliaths that you talked about. How do you get there? And I know that's that's a long question, and that's a battle that you're intricate.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely. I mean, I forget when we had the lawsuit, with the government. It would basically, at some point during Palantir's career, we were just shut out completely, where we couldn't even compete. And so, like, there's lots of they call them protests, but there's 80% of every acquisition type thing is protested in some capacity. It's actually fairly normal. In our capacity, and normally those things are, we didn't think that the competition was fair, or we lost and we're complaining about it and we just want to overturn that thing. When this goes back to your question, I promise. In our case, when we were fighting to break in, there was no on-road path that we could figure out. We just knew that there was this big friction of soldiers and operators wanted our platform, and for reasons that we didn't totally understand, they were forbidden from buying it. Mm-hmm. and then the existing system wasn't working, and there wasn't an off ramp, and it's there was no way to get there from there. And so then they had,
you guys want it. Your current stuff doesn't work, yet you don't want to buy it from us.
No, look, it'll be a movie at some point. It was crazy, but what we didn't understand was. Then finally they said, okay, well, we're going to recompete this. But then they wrote the competition around with this strange language where we couldn't compete, because it said that they were basically going to build it. And so when we saw that language, we said, so this was it was called a pre-award protest, which is, again, unusual because they didn't award it to anybody.
Right.
We were just saying, this is written in a way that it's written to exclude us. And why would you do that? And so anyway, long story short is, this is, a path of my life journey is, basically for 6 months or more, I had to become a corporate lawyer. I went to the Court of Federal Claims, and then the Circuit of Appeals and so forth. And we won both of those things, but I had to, really, really dive into the law. But basically there is a law it's called USCC 2377. And it's called the commercial item preference. And depending on how old you are, the audience is, there was this time in the 90s
I remember the 90s. Don't
Okay. Well, yeah. No, I know you, but I don't know how old your audience is, right? So, but during the 90s, there was this time where it used to be the preference of the government and the Department of Defense. The preference used to be bespoke everything, which is interesting, like military spec. Right. The idea, that's a term, right? It's like military spec, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But it was basically like the default mode was to invent everything on their own. And in the 90s, there was this big scandal in the early 90s around, the $400 hammers and the $200 toilet seats and whatever. You can Google this if you haven't heard of this. But basically, at that point, they changed the law. And they said, basically there is a commercial item preference for the government. You must buy commercial first. So the idea is, hey, if you need something, go to Home Depot and just go buy the hammer there instead of having Raytheon build the $400 hammer.
Well, I was a mechanized infantry platoon leader in 4th ID, and like that command inspection of what they call like the BII, all of the hammers and screwdrivers and everything was the absolute like most stressful thing you did for that very reason, because they didn't want you couldn't go at that point down to the Home Depot if you lost it. And you were sitting here saying like, so if I lose this thing, I owe you $400 for a hammer, and the thing cost me $15 at Home Depot.
Right. No, it's crazy, right? And so where this applies very importantly to software is that when you ask a main prime integrator to build a car or a tank or something like that, I say a car, but like a truck, like a Humvee or a M1 tank or something like that. They're actually pretty good about that. They're still expensive, but it works. It does the stuff, and you can tell it's like, okay, it only has 3 wheels. It doesn't work, right? But with software, it's like harder to tell. You're like, I don't know, does this work? I don't know. And it's harder to tell if it actually works. But so there's this a little bit of a mismatch between, can a casual observer detect whether this works or not? But in the software procurement space in particular, even though this law had been on the books since the 90s, the preference was always like services contracts of like, I'm going to have an army of contractors that are going to sit here and they're going to develop this stuff from scratch. And then it just almost never works. 93% of the time it literally fails, and then they just have to change the name. And so it became this huge problem. And so basically our case was the first time that the law had been enforced, in almost 20 plus years of it being around, really set a precedent, which was great. But it's a huge victory. And so the idea there is, so it's like a 3-part test. But the first thing is like when the government has this, this is all common sense, so it's like annoying that we even have to like go through this. But it's like you have a problem, right? And so the first thing you should ask is, does anybody make this?
Right.
Just you put it's called market research or whatever, but it's just sort of just ask a simple question: can anybody do this? And then you give a certain amount of time, and people raise their hand and say, yeah, you can do this. And they're like, okay, well, just show it to me, and just see that it works. And has anybody bought it in the world? So there's the presumption here is, if it's a commercial thing, that a commercial item, which basically means has a human being bought it in the world, there's a presumption that it works.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so in that capacity, it's like, if you can show up, you're eliminating, going back to your risk thing, you're eliminating for the government and the agency, you're eliminating the risk of failure, right? Just by doing that. And so the first part of the thing is, if there's a commercial item that meets your requirements, you just buy it and move on with your life. And then the second part of it is like, if it doesn't meet all of your requirements, but it meets some of your requirements, can you just buy that thing and then modify it?
Right.
That's the second part. And then the third kind of most stringent thing is, and this is the real presumption, is like, if it doesn't, can you just modify your requirements so that you would buy the most commercial stuff first, and then if you have to do a totally bespoke thing, it's a minimal part of this, because they always know that it's high risk of failure and it's really expensive. Anyway, so that's the ground, and so that's that's 4 or 5 years in the rearview mirror at this point. But we have seen, there's still a frozen middle who like didn't get the memo, and they don't know that that's still around. And so you still see little pockets of bureaucrats or acquisition people who are like, no, I'm going to build this and it's going to be amazing. I mean, it's a fool's errand, but whatever, it is what it is. So I'm still, you fight skirmishes around that, but as a whole, we're seeing really great movement, in Space Force, Air Force, Army. They got the memo. They understand, and this is really, this is important for our nation, right? Where it's like, if you want, in software in particular, we're the best in the world, period. And second is 10 levels behind us. But the problem, but where it gets scary is if we use that advantage and everyone is taking their talent, our best engineers are going to go sell ads or make video games, that's a problem.
Right.
And what we want to do is, how do we get those folks to work on government problems? And to get that ecosystem going, and this is also with Palantir, it's how do we get those people to want to work on these things? The good news is that a decent amount of people want to do this. There's a lot of patriotic people who really understand how important this is and how important we need to have a good government, right? Everyone wants a good government, a functioning government, and they mostly want security, right? There's different levels of people understanding what it means to have security and take it for granted or not. But I guarantee you 100% of people just want a functioning government, whether they understand international security and what that means. But we have to foster that environment. And to do that, you have to get those right people working on it. And you have to, and my plea to the government is you have to let people win. You have to have an environment where people want to do this so they don't just go build video games.
Right. Yeah, that talent, the talent management piece is, I think, is a critical part of building the company, but it's building the technology that has these strategic effects. And it all comes down to, in soft, we talk about the number one soft truth. People are more important than hardware. If we don't have the right people with the right set of skills, apply them to the right problem at the right time, then how do you have strategic implication? And I think that ties very well into this conversation about where are we with respect to the world order today. And, I told you I was going to bring in this concept that I spoke with Newt Gingrich about, which was the elements of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And the doctrinal term, if you remember from back in the day, right? I had to go dig that one out in preparation for that conversation.
That's too funny.
But I bring it up because you said that data was the new ammunition for the military. And when you think about the elements of national power, and you think about how does a country actually assert its influence globally, right? And it comes down to these four core principles, but you still can't do any of that without data. When you say that data is the new ammunition for the military, when you start looking ahead now, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, if you think about, you're trying to figure out what's going on. Right. Again, this is all about decision making. And this is this applies to every commercial organization in the world. But very specifically to your point, this applies to our government and our military in informing our civilian leaders to make the best decision possible. And if we think of, we have the best Air Force in the world by, order of magnitude, we have a very competitive space race. We need to understand, if you think about whether it's UAVs flying around, or you think of drones, or you think of satellites, it's depending on what part of the world you're talking about, you have limited ability or contested ability, it's a contested space where it's you can't just go fly a drone over Moscow, right. Or whatever, it's back in the day, it's we're trying to fly U-2s over, they're getting shot down, right? Yeah. So there's certain costs. If you want to figure out what's going on, you need to have some sensor that's going to figure it out. So you can make, again, going to the hypersonic question, is that you have to get left of the bang, right? So it's this has to happen. You have to make a decision, a really important decision before this happens, or else you've already lost, right? And so how do you figure out what's going on? And when you think about data as the ammunition, if you're going to have a plane in the air, you're going to have some electronic sensor that's intercepting signals. You think about all the ways that we collect information to make good decisions. this is literally our, military industrial complex, but it's certainly the DoD and the intelligence community helping inform our leaders. But if you think of satellites that are flying around, they're collecting information, whether it's electro-optical or synthetic aperture radar, or like looking through clouds. It's like, how do we know what's going on the ground? Is this fake? Is this real? How do we know it, right? And then what's the pedigree of that information, and how do you move it around so that you can make, because in many ways you're collecting, because this becomes a problem, is that you're collecting so much information. You talk about this big data term. There's so much information. How do you process it in a way that you can make a meaningful decision in a time period where it actually still matters? Because it's like you think of it as like, okay, well, this is just going to go to the base of, the basement of Langley or the Pentagon, and it's like in 6 months I'm going to get some PowerPoint slide. I mean, that's always the problem. Think of your time as a commander. You have all these national level assets. Are they available to you? No.
Yeah, no.
Right? Or sometimes there's such a plethora of these systems out there where you're like, okay, well, I have to go to 50 different websites. You're on a classified network and you have to go to 50 different websites to even find out where these things are. And then you have to download it. And then you're going to make your own PowerPoint slide and then send it. Or you're a commander and you send in a request for information and it takes you 3 weeks to get something back. That's not useful anymore because the event already happened. Right. And so you have to figure out. And so that's an example of not having ammunition. Yeah. Right. Because you don't have the information. You didn't know. And so how can you get that information? And this is about getting it to the commanders. You talk about there's this term called the tactical or the strategic corporal. Mm-hmm. You heard this term where it's like a low ranking person who has strategic importance because they're at the pointy end of the spear where it matters. Right. Where this is a good thing and a really bad thing. Right. Where it's like, these lower level players become political and strategic in nature, but they don't have the same tools that the president would have, right? I mean, I'm not saying that there's reasons that you don't want them to have this as well, but long story short is, how can you get as much information that's possible that somebody is allowed to see to the lowest level possible? And that's like. It's certainly what Palantir is working on every day is like, how do we move all of this information around so that it gets to people so they can make the decision? But that is an example of that. The ammunition is the lifeblood. It's like, if you can't make that decision, it could have really significant implications.
And you're never taking the human out of the loop. And you said that you're, quote, not a fan of taking humans out of the loop. I think about AI.
Sure.
And AI is a big component of what you guys are working with. But you've said that AI must be functional and it must be useful. I think about AI in terms of a lot of ways. I think about leadership in that there's a lot of people who talk about it. There's few who know what it actually means.
Sure.
The job of AI is to really collate information and then make these recommendations for decision makers, as you've said. When you look forward and you look at how we can now apply all of these tools to this strategic corporal, how do you see the future of AI, and how, essentially, what's next? What's next for that battlefield corporal and for the president?
Yeah, I think, you're right in the sense that most people don't understand what AI is. And the term AI can be so broad and so misused that it's almost like a fake term.
Well, people say AI, they'll say AI and ML, like it's just like, oh, now I know what I'm talking about, right? I said AI and ML.
I said it together, yeah.
It's or like, the algorithm. Yeah. The algorithm does it. The algorithm does what? It.
Yeah. I mean, so machine learning in terms of an art is actually like a real thing, right? It's actually like you can find functioning through. When I make the term of like AI or AI and ML, it's like I do believe in my I'm proud of you for seeing that quote. You're probably the first person who actually listened to that thing. But it is important in terms of most AI just doesn't work at all, right? There's this two-step forward. Is like you actually have to have an algorithmic approach that actually works. It does something, actually works, and then that thing that works has to be useful, right? And then that's like because the interesting paradigm, and this is where where the broader mission of Palantir actually feeds into the AI universe and making it work is many people don't realize that when you have an algorithm that works and you have you're going to pitch this idea of look at this wonderful thing, it's oftentimes that algorithm has been placed on top of very curated subsection of data that's in its own enclave, that's not connected to the real world. And then you show infinite profit increases, you show infinite efficiency increases in this laboratory environment. Mm-hmm. And then the challenge always is, okay, now how do you apply that to the real world? And then what are you actually doing with it? Right? Oftentimes what you find is, what we see with people who think they want to have AI, they actually just want integrated data. It's pretty interesting. They have to go through this journey. But what you find is that the algorithms need to be applied to the real world in its raw form. And how do you, because the models have to change. This is where the learning comes in, is that as you're seeing, if you think about computer vision is probably the most, there's a bunch of different ways that AI can be useful, but you can apply it to supply chain things of just understanding constraints and how do you model for changes and what do you do. But our approach is about, so two things. Is one that you have to have AI or machine learning be effective at all. First, you have to have a working operating system or architecture that combines all of the real world data into one place to then give to the algorithms to learn on, mm-hmm. right? And so that's actually a challenge, because normally where all these projects normally fail is you come up with some cool algorithm and then you realize, ooh, I have to actually do all of the stuff that Palantir does. I have to invent that. Right. And so then you're like, okay, well, it's going to take me 5 years to integrate all this data before I even get to the fun part of AI, is to apply the learning of the algorithms, right, and see how useful it is. And so most of these projects fail because of that. And so our approach is hey, how about if you skip that other part and you just show up and we're going to serve up integrated data with security, and then you can lay your algorithms on top, and then you can start the learning process, work with partners and all this stuff. And so that part of it, I think we're going to really change how useful AI machine learning can be to organizations. And then the second part is hey, when you figure out what happens, when you get to that part where you start to get to the fun part, is this useful? So in terms of okay, well, you think of computer vision, that's this idea of you're looking at a camera, whether this is a sensor from a satellite or it's from a UAV or from a security camera or whatever. It's okay, as you're looking at this thing, are you detecting that a human being is there? Oh, okay, well, good job. Right. Is that useful? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I just saw a sheep on here, and okay, I counted a car. Okay. There's very low level value in these things. And then how do you get it to what's the useful part of this? What is unusual? And then how can you use the algorithms to sort of detect what is happening here that's unusual that you wouldn't normally find? So because sometimes you get to this point where you're looking at so much information, you're just drowning, and then person, you can't get to the point of making a real decision. So it's if you think of some, there's certain sensors have 8 to 10, or I should say certain platforms have 8 to 10 sensors on them. And if you have one person trying to analyze all these things and to look for things, it's how do you get the machines to do what the machines are good at and keep humans doing the things that humans are good at, of assessing, making a thoughtful decision, understanding the broader dynamics that machines will never do. And that's always been the philosophy of Palantir, is to be agnostic of there's no magic button where you press this and it says find bad guy, mm-hmm. right? We've always believed that that's wrong. It's about how do you collate the massive amounts of data, process it in a way that it becomes useful, where the human can then be served a bunch of options, but it's done all the hard work of filtering first. But then you can always understand at a human level the pedigree of it. Think of it as many people are scared of AI because they think of a black box. They're I don't know what the hell's going on in here. I don't understand it. I just know that it's saying launch a missile or something. And we've always believed that that's wrong, right? But it's about the idea of like, okay, how can I detect a bunch of things that you wouldn't see? And just bringing that to the forefront, right? You just don't see these things because you can't find it. It's hidden, or there's too much information. How do you filter through that? Those are really useful purposes, in terms of understanding how do you get to that decision. But then I like to use the term of a glass box of like, how do you understand the pedigree of the pipeline that got you there? Like, what are the data sources that it came from before it got here? And then what does the algorithm actually do in terms of its recommendations? And then what are the biases of the recommendation and all this other stuff? But you have to do that as a partnership with the organization. So you've thought through all these things in a meaningful way where it's like in keeping with the ethics of the organization.
There's a term data lake, which I know you don't like the term data lake.
Well, because it always turns into a data swamp.
Right. Well, no, it's true. Yeah. But that's why I think of it. And that's why I throw it out here, because you have, what is a data lake? It's just this lake that you throw all this information into.
No,
but what are you going to do with it? And how are you going to?
No, it's hilarious. I mean, that's actually like why we've got a lot of business, Palantir, from solving, like, say 5 years ago, data lakes were all the rage.
Yeah.
And it was like this idea of like, oh, we're going to have this new data lake. It's going to be amazing. It's going to solve we're going to take all of our disparate data. Again, this is the data integration problem. It's like you have 50 years of IT infrastructure and you're like, okay, well, we have a new data lake. We're just going to dump it in there. Mm-hmm. Right. And so then all of a sudden you've integrated the data. Right. But the problem that approach has is you lose the security, you lose the pedigree of the information. It's not a live thing anymore, and you're just dumping it all in there. And you're like, well, I don't know, and so that's a core fundamental of Palantir, is that you have to keep the lineage of that data so you understand where it came from.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to make a real decision, you're like, where does this number come from? And then people start tap dancing around. You remember back in the day when it was like the Intel officer or the S2 would be like, why do you know this? And then that's when the tap dance starts,
Right, yeah.
And you're like, because it's on the PowerPoint side and someone else handed it to me.
Yeah. I don't have been briefing this thing since I got here.
Yeah. And so, but the idea is like, hey, can you legitimately, like right now, while we're standing here, can we audit this information? Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about a 6 because I'm going to launch a missile.
Right.
And somebody's live, are we making a mistake here? Can we audit this? We're making an adult decision, and I want to make sure that I understand where this information comes from. No messing around. And right at that moment, it's like, that's where, the hard work that we've tried to solve is that this isn't about politics and who is the biggest influencer in the room. This is objective. And we know where this came from.
You mentioned the term lifetime of service to the nation. You've ascribed to that in all the various roles that you've held, but you've also started a new venture, and I want to ask you about Snowpoint Ventures. This is another opportunity where you've said that you are investing back in America, and you're continuing to try to bridge this gap between the public and the private partnership. Bring technology solutions to a place where the government can be much more accepting of them. What kind of ventures are you looking for? What's the vision behind Snowpoint, and what are you looking to achieve?
Well, this goes a little bit back to your comment about national power and our place in the new world order, or whatever the world order. Whatever
we don't know what it is.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Whatever. This is yet to be defined.
Right, but the idea here is, look, America is in this strange place right now where we're having to decide, is like, do we want to be the light on the hill and the actual world leader or not? And, China would be happy to take that place from us. Mm-hmm. And if, when I think of like the government of like, with the Department of Defense of like not leaning into our best entrepreneurs or picking winners of like, China they're taking their best stuff and they're just going all in, right? And then our government is in this weird place where they're sort of competing against their own industrial base in this strange world. And so when I thought about that, it's like this might be a time where we are strangely choosing to lose. And I'm like, I'm not losing. And like to the extent that I can influence this in any ways, when I thought of my journey at Palantir and what Palantir has tried to do is that, look, we did 1,000 things wrong and probably 100 things right, but all of that is learning. And so when I thought about this lifetime of service of like, how can I pay back or give back and foster this environment of like, to the extent that Palantir is perceived to, at least, I think it's a little bit of, because we're just starting really, so it's like this idea that we've won, but we've broken in at least, right? Yeah. And to the extent that we've learned about, you could skip these steps, like how do you get new entrepreneurs who really who are patriotic, who want to solve these problems for the government? How do you help them skip all those painful lessons that we had to learn at Palantir? Or just like accelerate, and just do the right things and skip the bad things. And the idea there is that like, if we do this, we're going to get more and more entrepreneurs who, because they can be successful, right? Because they can actually like, solve these hard problems for the government and then get paid. And it's like a real business, and it's like, that's all goodness, right? And you can then I know that we will secure our borders, secure our place in the world, keep free trade, keep security, keep democracy thriving. Like all of this will happen, but there's the price is, we have to keep being the best. And so then the idea was like, okay, well, how can I get, through the venture capital firm, how can I support those entrepreneurs who want to work in this and then help them through, call it a coalition of the competent. How do we get this technology to the government? But if there's a lot of automation, in terms of like an autonomous second pilot in cargo aircraft, or like in the military, it's like how the pilots are doing 17 things. How do you get redundancy so you can get rid of the second pilot, or the second pilot can do more things? Like all the there's always more in the military, right? Right. Or like, how do you understand like true autonomy in drones? Like actually, instead of like autopilot, it's like actually like learning. Or how do you get like, with real augmented reality that works in planes outside, going 600 miles an hour, how can you get all of that information to a pilot? These are like, or how do you like, create real learning environments for machine learning? All of these things are super important for the next level of innovation that all play on the same stuff that Palantir was doing in terms of like, I'm moving data around to make decisions, period. And how can I do more with less and faster?
Can I ask you about cycling?
Yes, I wish I was riding my bike right now.
I'm gonna get you there soon.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, cycling in terms of like I was a cyclist when I was a kid. It was like it was my high school sport. Obviously it wasn't at my high school, but I was a state champion as a kid in Arizona. Anyway, I loved it. And I got back into it. I joined the Army and kind of didn't do it for a few years. But when I was at West Point, I was on the cycling team and did that. And then when I went back in the military, I didn't do it forever. But once I was retired, and I had 3 back surgeries. But it ended up, luckily, the one thing that I could do was ride a bike.
Yeah.
And so during my recovery period, it was like, I got back into racing, and it was great in terms of low impact, and it's super competitive. For me, it's like that outlet of, you can be doing intervals and you're like, bleeding out of your eyeballs, but it's like you get rid of all the stress in the world, and you're just thinking about, what power output and what's your heart rate, and setting your time. Anyway, but there's a lot of strategy in it. But I absolutely love cycling.
How's the Palantir cycling team?
Well, it's not much of a team now.
It's an army of one. It's you.
No, we actually have. No, we have. Well, they don't necessarily ride for Palantir right now, but we have a lot of really good athletes. And there's one young guy who was the men's elite district championship for the Mid-Atlantic region, which is like a big deal. He could be like a domestic pro, but like a domestic pro cyclist makes about $12,000 a year.
Yeah. So you got to do something else.
So yeah, he'll live on his parents' couch and get a free bike. That's about it. But yeah, no, I mean, cycling's it's always been it's been amazing for me. Just need more time in the day.
Yeah. Doug, as we close out, the Jedburghs had to do 3 things in World War II as core foundational tasks to be successful. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, they had to be able to communicate. If they did these 3 things with the utmost proficiency, their energy, their focus could be focused on other things, other more complex challenges, making sense of the chaos that came their way. What are the 3 things that you do every day as core foundational tasks to set yourself up for success in your world?
Well, I think, I don't know if I'm going to give you 3 things, but I can certainly answer a little bit of the question. If I think about, a superpower, like what is my superpower? Like we talk about that a lot at Palantir of like focusing on your superpower and then not, this is like something that's very different than military leadership. Where you think of like, there's this idea of like, it's about getting everybody really well-rounded. Mm-hmm. And when I went to Palantir, there was something interesting that I it's way more about specialization. And I had to learn that for a while, where you're like, you like, what are the incremental gains of being well-rounded, right? And it's like, when I say the real world, it's like, that's kind of a funny term, but I was like, some of the stuff is like,
non-military.
Okay, yeah, not military.
Yeah.
It's about specialization, but part of
I still call it that. I've been out for like 6 years.
Yeah. But part of specialization and like, it's literally about understanding your superpowers. Because like, you see, a lot of folks at Palantir have, they've gone to Harvard, they went to Yale, they went to MIT, blah, blah, blah. And they're always like the best, sir, whatever that funny movie was. Mm-hmm. And they've never been told that they did anything bad in their entire life. And then they'll show up to Palantir and be like, yeah, you kind of suck, And so I probably say answer your question, but part of this understanding is that, what are you really good at? Like extraordinarily good at, and focus on that. And the best thing that you can do to actually make yourself better and well-rounded is just don't do those things that you suck at. And there's usually a light bulb moment of people who, can you realize that or not? That you're not actually good at everything. And focus on the thing you're doing. And so, look, I don't know exactly what my superpower is, but one of the things that I do think that I'm pretty good at is the idea of like, what can I do today that is going to actually move the needle? Like, because there's so much noise and there's so much like, does this meeting matter? It's probably annoying because I'm like I blow stuff off all the time. I'm like, that's stupid. I'm just kind of not doing that, and maybe nobody will call me. But I've kind of done that my whole life, and people are used to it. But there is this important time of thinking about like, what can I actually do that's going to really move the needle and it'll make an extraordinary impact, and then figuring out what that is and really focusing on that, and don't let that fall off the plate. Because there's always, it's like, I feel like there's this idea of like, look, just to be clear, losers measure work. You think about that for a second. It's like the work doesn't matter unless you're like talking about it retrospectively of like, measuring inputs is another way. I'm not measuring inputs. I'm measuring the output. Like, did you win? Let's talk about that. How are you going to win? Figuring out the decisive point. And this is where the military training actually is very useful for me. It's like understanding, how do you figure out how to win? And what are the supporting efforts? What do I really need to do to win? And focus everything on the decisive point. And then what are the enablers I need to do? And like, this is where my journey at war or whatever has been quite useful for me, is just figuring that out. It's not like, I'm not like Stan in the sense of like I have some formula and I pull out doctrine. That's not me.
He's got a lot of lists.
Yeah, but no offense, Stan. But
we love Stan. We clear that up.
Yeah, but this is like, there's definitely intuition. like, this is good, okay, I know how to do this. And then, I will see through the matrix and be like, okay, this is what we need to do. And this is how we're going to get there. And I need to do these things.
All right. I've got your 3. You gave me 3 or 4.
Okay. That was great. Okay.
All right. Focus on my superpower. All of them are going to be focused. Focus on my superpower. Focus on what moves the needle. Focus on what it takes to win.
Okay.
I think those are great.
That. Okay. I'll take that.
I like them. We talk in all of our episodes about the 9 characteristics of elite performance defined by Special Operations Command. We tie them into the conversation. We talked about many of them here: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. To be a high performer in any organization, especially as we've taken those from SOF and we used that framework to recruit, assess, and select talent, you have to display those in varying degrees depending on the situation that you're in. I say that because you certainly have exhibited all of those throughout your career and in what you do today. But I think about one when I sit across from my guests at the end of our conversation. I say, this is the one that I believe you exemplify. And for you, I think it is this curiosity. And the reason I say that is because curiosity is the core tenet and characteristic that drives innovation. It's what challenges the status quo. It's what drive and resiliency and adaptability, those are built upon somebody's ability to wake up every morning and say, can I do it better? Can I do it differently? Can I motivate myself, my team, everyone around me to go to the next level? When I talk to you, when I learned about you over the course of the last couple of weeks, as we've spoken, as we sit here today and have this conversation, so much of that comes down to the challenge of the status quo. Be better tomorrow than we were today, and it starts with that curiosity. Doug, I thank you for having me here today. I appreciate so much this conversation, learning about you. I have one more question, and then you got to get cycling.
Yes.
What does my T-shirt say? And we have to have Dan get the camera on the other angle, so that we can do it.
You can understand. You can understand.
You're going to need to figure it out, and I'll give it to you. But it took me a long time.
Oh, that's hilarious. No, it's funny because we have at Palantir, this is early history of the company, but we had these element T-shirts. And so every time there was a new version of Palantir, we would have a new T-shirt of it started with carbon and then went through the periodic table. But this particular shirt, there's also team shirts and so forth. And it's just this is one that I don't think I've ever seen before.
Okay, you ready?
Yes. Yeah.
Don't quit. Yeah, it's definitely don't quit my day job. But what it says is, what it says here is, so this is P plus rho.
Okay.
Pro, fez, or professor.
Okay.
Okay. Cold plus the H, art. Professor Cold Heart.
Fascinating.
And that took me a lot of time to figure out.
Yes. No, I'll do some research, figure out who made that T-shirt. No, that's pretty funny. But anyway, no, it was. I mean, hopefully, some human being will find this useful.
Absolutely. Thanks, Doug.
All right, thank you.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor Jersey Mike Subs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.